Ladies and gentlemen, let's RedGamers.com video. We're going to be doing an analysis of infamous Second Son's engine. This is from the GDC Post-Mortem document that Sucker Punch actually released. Now, I've done this as an article as well, and I'd strongly recommend, if you want more information, to check it out, because I go into a lot of analysis of what certain things are, and also go into a lot more breakdown of what I could possibly do in the video. Plus as well, there are various images from the relevant slides and much more besides. So this is part one, because there is a lot more to this. They've basically released a series of these PDF documents which go into exhaustive detail of the game engine. And basically I've done the majority, which is in this video we're going to be discussing the PS4's memory and how they've utilized it, the CPU, multi-threading as well, and some stuff regarding compute. In not too long I'll be putting up stuff regarding well, pretty much everything else. So in other words, the visual effects, the rest of the compute stuff, anti-aliasing, frame rate, and so forth. So anyway, let's jump right in. So of course, when infamous Second Son's first original screenshots were unveiled, it was pretty obvious that it was going to be pretty impressive visually. And the game kind of was met with a few criticisms regarding the gameplay. Personally, I don't share those, but that's my own, opinion and all. And the game at its most basic core runs at 1920 by 1080 with an unlocked frame rate. Theoretically, it can go up to about 60 FPS from my own internal testing. It's fairer to say it's between 30 to 40. Generally, I've noticed it's slightly south of 35, unless things get really busy, in which case it can certainly go into the mid-20s. So, the PS4's memory situation. Well, it's got the PS4, let's actually just go over the basics, just so we're all on the same page. I imagine most of you would know this anyway, but still. PS4 is using 8 GB of GDDR5 memory, and that's running on a 256-bit memory bus at 5500 MHz effective. That provides you with the now legendary 176 GB second of memory bandwidth. Pretty much synonymous with the console, I'm sure you'll agree. So we learned before the PS4 was even released that you'd be getting less memory than 8 for the games. That was fairly obvious anyway, because obviously you've got operating system overheads. As it turns out, they're actually larger than what the original early estimates and leaks were. The original early estimates were between 1 and 2, most people assuming about 1.5 GB. However, with Sucker Punch, it looks like we're using 4.5 GB of the memory. So, before we go further into the infamous stuff, let's discuss the possible uses. It's a bit difficult to know. Most likely, the operating system is only using between 1 to 2 GB now. Obviously, I don't have the development tools of the PS4, and probably even game developers don't actually have a breakdown of what the memory for the PS4 is being used for in terms of operating system side. But if I had to guess, it's most likely it's not using all of that unaccounted memory. It's likely that they're using some of this for, say, virtual reality or future applications. Sony basically can't claw this back later on, so they're pretty much just holding it and seeing what happens, is my personal guess. So with infamous Second Son, 2.5 GB are taken up by the game's main assets. So this is going to be things such as textures and just general bits and pieces. It's not really surprising that it takes up so much memory. I mean, textures are expensive. I'm also going to be doing a breakdown, by the way, I don't remember if I mentioned this, of the Order 1886. That's coming up soon as well. And you can see just how that is coming down as well. That's also from GDC 2014. So there's flexible memory, which has actually got 0.5 gigs. Now they actually do a typo on this, though I can't really complain too much about typos. pretty much the king of them, but flexible memory, also known as flexible memory, which it should actually be, is likely referring to the PS4's own flexible memory system. Now, to get you all on the same page, flexible memory is RAM managed by the PlayStation 4's operating system on behalf of the title. Supposedly, the PS4 also has another 512 megabytes of memory that's paged. Now, this memory pretty much acts like the PC's swap file. So if you've got a Windows PC and you're familiar with the swap file on it, there you go. So theoretically, from what Sony is stating, this gives 5 gigabytes of memory available for games. Now, here's the part that's a little bit confusing. If you look and calculate all of the memory together, it's actually coming to about 4.6 gigabytes, right, if you add up all of the numbers. So my guess is, because, hang on, let me get the slide, I've got so many bloody tabs open, there we go. They state, and I quote, we used almost all of the 4.5 gigabytes available. So my guess, just a pure guess, because they don't go any further down than this, is the 5.5 gigs, which obviously is 512 megabytes, which equals the same amount. They are likely not counting this and that, and therefore you've got about 5 gigabytes of memory available for games. Although this is a source of contention, I'm not going to report that as 100% factually accurate. Anyway, I'm going to move on to stuff that is fairly factually accurate. Atlases and buffers. So they weigh in at 370 megabytes. Texture atlases are specifically stated for many purposes, and typically, according to Sucker Punch, take up about 200 megabytes of data all on their lonesome. Now, in case you're not too familiar with what a texture atlas is, it's basically a group of textures and materials which are packed together. This is for the sake of optimization of draw calls, rather than forcing the system to farm out multiple draw calls. Sorry guys, my phone's just absolutely gone crazy there. Farm out multiple draw calls per texture, which is a waste of resources, to say the least. So, there's also a second benefit to atlases as well, and that is texture dimensions. They don't, generally speaking, texture dimensions have to be square. So, for example, 256 by 256, 512 by 512, so forth. Generally speaking, for consoles, high resolution is like 1024 by 1024. Just for your FYI. Now that's great if you find that that's all you need. For example, let's just use a really simple and crappy example, something like a wall, right? It's, you know, just a square image, it fits perfectly. But what about if it's something like that's got an odd shape? So either you could wrap the texture, or you could basically use these atlases to get an odd shaped texture, or a texture that kind of matches your needs better. This means that you're not wasting memory bandwidth or memory itself, because obviously larger textures take up more memory space. In other words, more KB in memory, as well as costing more memory bandwidth to actually shift around and that type of thing. So that's definitely pretty important. So what about graphics buffers / render targets? So they take up 290 megabytes, and you've got to remember that infamous Second Son is rendered fully at 1080p. That's 1920 by 1080, just for your FYI. And they hold a variety of different things: shadow maps, gloss, ambient, diffuse, lighting, sun shadows, God knows what else, including alpha stuff as well, stencil, which is obviously for various transparencies and that type of thing. And I go into some pretty hardcore maths into this, not really, but that's pretty simple. I have done this in the article, as I said, so you can check them out, because I'm certainly not going to read out all of these calculations, because it's going to take me a while. But RGBA, this basically means red, green, blue, and alpha, which are pretty much the channels that make up the image. 8. So in this case, RGB 8 means that you're basically looking at 8 bits per channel. So every pixel, in this case, because you've got RGBA, that means you're taking out 32. So let's say that you wanted to calculate a buffer, in this case, say 1 RGBA8, you would do 32 times 1920 by 1080 divided by 8, and then if you wanted to, you could start breaking it down by like 1024 to give you a more simple number. But if you wanted to, a super accurate in terms of byte/KB, that type of thing, then you could just divide it by 8. As I said, if you add all of them up, I'm certainly not going to read out all of them, but if you add all of them up, you're left with about 85 megabytes of memory taken up by all the buffers. So obviously render targets in this respect make sense. Next, command buffers. For those of you who don't know, a command buffer is basically pretty much what it implies. It holds GPU commands in storage. I've gone heavily into what a command buffer is in my DirectX 12 analysis, so you can check that out if you're not too sure. But generally speaking, these commands can either be held, stored if they're, say, constant commands, or they might just be temporary little things. Heap, by the way, is memory that's being used while a task is being executed. It's basically dynamic memory of the program, and when a variable or a new object is created, it's stored, and then requires basically the programmer to carefully manage it. Meanwhile, Sucker Punch dedicate 100 MB for this, just for your FYI. Okay, so let's move on to the PS4's CPU threading. So the PS4, just so we're all clear, uses the AMD Jaguar, which is an x86/64-bit CPU, and unlike a standard Jaguar cores, this actually uses 2 modules of 4 cores, that's 8 total, and has a link between the 2 modules to basically share information between them. So in other words, let's say a task has to be moved from, say, module A to module B, or let's say all CPUs, basically all, so that they can all communicate and all know what each others are doing. As we discussed in actually our Naughty Dog analysis, there's a link to that in the article that I've written for this. There's actually a massive performance hit if you're accessing data that's stored in the other cluster's cache. It's actually so bad, it's pretty much as bad as accessing from main memory in terms of the latency that's associated with it. Just for your knowledge, the 2 Jaguar cores, 2 of the Jaguar cores, 2 of the 8, are actually reserved for OS functionality. And don't ask me what the clock speed of the PS4's CPU is, because right now it's a massive cause of debate. Estimates are between 1.6 and 1.75 gigahertz, although one single figure hasn't really been pinpointed, and Sony are remaining fairly tight-lipped. As to why they're remaining tight-lipped, I have absolutely no idea. So as you'd expect, Infamous Second Son does rely on hundreds of jobs being performed on the CPU per cycle. And of course, the engine is indeed built to take full advantage of GPU and CPU parallel processing. So this means that, for example, animation, lighting, command buffers, and particle collision, they're going to have like 50 threads each plus. Indeed, some of them have like 100 plus, and draw, for example, has like draw/sort has over 100 different commands running at the same time. So you can have like 5 jobs over like 5,000 cycles, pretty much. So, what else is there? Now, the good news is the PS4's processor, from the most part, does appear to be pretty effective. Now, they have mentioned things such as thread contention. Now, thread contention is basically a process where a thread is left waiting on a particular resource until it's been freed up. So I'll give an example of thread A and thread B. Let's assume thread A wishes to perform an operation on a specific object, but it's currently being worked on and locked by thread B, so all thread A can do is wait. Meanwhile, animation uses submit and kicks. I'm just taking their slides and kind of explaining further. So animation uses submit and kicks at high granularity. Now, submit and kicks. Basically, submitting a thread is very similar as the name would imply. You're basically submitting a work item into the thread pool. In other words, a pool of threads that have already been, started off, and then that thread is then kicked off, which means it's basically started. So higher granularity, on the other hand, means how many threads that are working on things. This comes down to really the developer and what they're trying to achieve on the hardware they're using. Higher granularity means that you're going to be using more threads to do little amounts of work per thread, whereas on the other hand, the opposite is that you could have fewer threads which are doing lots of work each. So this can obviously result in higher levels of communication overhead if you're going with higher levels of granularity, but you've also got a greater deal of control. So you've got more control but at the expense of complexity and more communication overhead. Now, they are specifically stating that they've had best results when it comes to physics and pathing using atomics. Atomics are basically using shared memory, and it's complete in a single step relative to other threads. So effectively, this one's kind of complicated to explain, but it's basically when you're accessing a shared data resource, you need to be careful that the data doesn't become corrupt or other issues, because let's say that two processors are accessing the same resource. As you know, order of operations when, say, it comes to math and that type of thing can make a huge difference in the final result. So therefore atomics are left with to perform a read, modify and then write operation. So what basically happens here is that while a memory location is being worked on, it's basically blocked so that others can't do anything with it. It's pretty much just locked out, and this is how physics and so on are working on their pathing, so that effectively speaking it doesn't get all screwed up, and they're finding that's giving them the best performance as so far. Workers, they specifically state, are not locked and actually find that core swapping is inefficient, but it's better than preemption. That's what they specifically state. So this means that a worker thread isn't bound to a particular CPU core. So in other words, they're not saying, okay, thread 22 is bound and cannot move from CPU core 3. Just, throwing out a simple example. So it could jump between various CPU cores depending what's got basically processing time available. There is some inherent latency associated with switching between different cores, because obviously it means that the data has to be moved to that processor, particularly if it's on a different module. And in those cases, it has to be copied, possibly into the local cache, and then it has to actually be started. But they found that with the infamous Second Son engine, it's still more efficient, in other words, better performance than preemption. Preemption is basically the act of pausing a task and then resuming it at a later time, so that all processors get their fair share of time slice. So let's assume one processor is really busy, or one CPU core is really busy. Rather than having a process pause on that core while it's dealing with other stuff, it's actually better just to jump it to a less busy core, I believe is what they're referring to here. The good news is, however, the CPU is able to handle up to 30,000 draw calls. They're actually instancing it to about 10,000, which is very impressive indeed. They're actually animating 50 to 100 animated characters on the screen, 300 bones each. Interestingly enough, they're saying that prefetching of data isn't a replacement for the SPUs of the PS3's DMA. Now, in case you're not too sure about what SPUs are and the cell processor of the PS3, you could type in cell or PlayStation 3 Post-Mortem, various other phrases on the channel, and you'll come up with my analysis of the PS3's cell processor. I'm going to be doing more analysis on this prefetch versus SPU DMA thing, because it's quite a big, complicated document. Can you not feel yourself bleeding from the nose from this information overload? Maybe not, but still, fun, isn't it? So, infamous Second Son uses GPU compute for a number of different tasks. Lighting, they use it for things such as particles and so on. And so As we've mentioned up to one time, there is a link to this so you can get more information, but effectively it's very similar, the GCN architecture inside the PS4, very similar to the Volcanic Islands GPU to AMD. That is, they beefed up the compute queue structure, the ACE engines and so on, and Sony also implemented volatile bit to level 2 cache of this GPU. This basically means that, let's say you've got a piece of data, let's say, just make this really simple and say you've got 100 lines of code in level 2 cache, and let's say lines 4 and 10 are related to GPU, in other words compute stuff. Let's say all you want to do is modify line 4. Well, unless you've got volatile bit and or a way to do this another way, what you have to do is basically flush the cache or just keep it there. Whereas on the other hand, volatile bit basically marks that piece of data with an extra bit of code. And so if you want to just flush line 4 or line 10 or whatever, you can do so using compute, and it makes it a lot more fluid. In addition to that, each of the level 2 cache inside it is also fully coherent. This I'm reading from GCN white papers, so I'm assuming it also holds true for the PS4. And so they're fully coherent, which means each of the compute units, by the way, holds 64 shaders, and there's 18 inside the PS4. So each of those can access and see the same piece of data to work on it. So that's kind of one of the ways that computing works. So the good news is there's positives and negatives. Well, primarily the good news is positives. Obviously the good news isn't as negatives. GPUs are incredibly parallel when it comes to computing. That's basically their silver bullet on how they do things. As I've mentioned before, GPUs aren't really that smart in terms of their methods. They just are really, really fast. But it can lead to some latency issues, which we'll discuss in just a moment. So they could actually throw hundreds of little processors, shaders, onto a problem, and those shaders can all come together to work on one piece of data. This basically using SIMD, that's single instruction multi-data. Or you could have just one working on something. It's a simple problem. Let's just say 1 + 1. Obviously, you don't need 1,500 shaders. Okay, it's not 1,500 the PS4, but I'm just kind of using it for exaggerative purposes. But still, you don't need that many to do simple math. But on the other hand, you might need them more to do, say, more complicated stuff like hit detection or particle physics and that type of thing. So, as I mentioned, the GPU isn't without problems. So, despite the fact that the PS4's GPU is very easy to use, it has a large cache, which is perfect to load up lots of data. It can modify that data extremely fast. It's extremely powerful. It's fairly easy to program, and so on. It does have some issues. The first is that it's still using the same resource that is responsible for graphics, producing the graphics on screen. So you can do all the careful queuing in the world, but in reality there's only a certain amount of performance the PS4's GPU can handle, 1.84 T-flops, and that's being split over multiple tasks. So because all of this relies on latencies, in other words how many milliseconds it takes for the GPU to have a job submitted and then calculated, remember that as these milliseconds are ticking, if it takes longer than a certain amount of time, you're going to start seeing slowdown on screen. In other words, the frame rate is going to start suffering. So, the PS4's CPU and GPU are located on exactly the same physical die. It's not a stacked die, they're basically side by side. You can see die shots if you really want. I believe Chipworks did some pretty good ones. So you could type in Google Chipworks PS4 APU and you'd come up with some cool stuff. And data is shared between the CPU and the GPU in a fast manner. It's basically like an interconnect between them, and there's also multiple buses. Most people would agree that it's going at about 20 gigabytes per second, but Sony have not confirmed that, so I'm just using 20 gigabytes, but it could be faster, it could be slower. I'm just going with the most popular number that seems to be banded about. The PS4's memory architecture is HUMA. That's Heterogeneous Unified Memory Architecture. I've done a lot more on what that is. I've done an article on it. You can click on it. But it basically means the CPU and GPU are accessing and addressing exactly the same memory space. So a GPU doesn't need to copy a piece of data from one location for another location for the CPU to then work on it, for then the CPU to copy that back to a different memory location. All this basically means is that you're reducing latency and time for the data to be kind of pushed backwards and forwards. So it's important for you to actually remember that data has to be synced correctly between GPU and CPU for processing. So effectively, they're addressing the right piece of data that's in the correct state. So there are issues regarding this. This is due to things such as uncertainty when a piece of data will arrive, either for the GPU or CPU, in other words, when it's going to be ready for the other one to process, from either main memory and cache, that type of thing. So it's important to optimize. But due to the unpredictability nature of it's hard to simply do this, and GPUs are known to give great performance in high parallel throughput orientated tasks, but because they could basically better hide latencies which are associated with it, so you need to basically be very careful with what you're submitting to the GPU. You have to do this like analysis. If I submit this task to the GPU, will the time that I'm submitting this task to the GPU, and that GPU then starting it, processing the data, and so forth and so forth and so forth, because remember, the GPU can't do anything without the CPU telling it, so it has to tell the GPU, okay, this is what I need you to do, then the GPU needs to process it and queue it and then process it rather. So is it going to be just faster and more efficient for the CPU to just handle it itself? And obviously that's kind of what you have to make a decision, and obviously the game engine's also making this decision as well. So despite the fact that the PS4 HUMA design largely does remove the need for memory copy because of the shared memory space, there are other issues which are associated with this. A large part of the overhead and performance actually comes from the coarse granularity of the sync. We've gone over that already, what granularity is. And typically, GPU works on a piece of data while others are being fetched, for it to work on, and thus there's a constant flow of data is being provided, so this actually helps to hide what the latency is. So in other words, it's kind of like almost like a conveyor belt in that respect. Let's say you've got a conveyor belt with a box and you've got to pack something into a box. It doesn't really make sense for, you know, the conveyor belt to stop while you're putting an item into the box. It's better if the conveyor belt continues to move along at, you know, at a sensible speed, so that the next one's ready for you to package and process when it comes along, right? So they have mentioned, however, the long-term compute can be a problem. Now I'm guessing this is because you can't really just constantly dedicate a certain amount of basically processes, in this case shaders, to compute, because obviously they have to do other things, so prioritizing graphics work is the most important. You've also got issues with divergent branches. They actually mention that they are basically the devil incarnate, and that there's actually a lot of work that's going on right now regarding divergent branches. NVIDIA are doing a lot regarding CUDA, which is basically their own proprietary language, which is running on this. Obviously, the PS4 uses AMD's technologies, but you know, they're pretty similar to one another. Divergent branches, which is basically when a thread in the group, the same group that's being executed on, takes a different path during a conditional branch. So this basically means when a thread inside a group, by the way, to clarify a group, NVIDIA calls these warps, and AMD refers to them as wavefronts. So these are basically like, you know, the smallest group of instructions that can be executed. Let's say one of those takes a different execution path, you're going to get like a performance loss. And because they all have to be submitted together, like all the jobs have to be submitted together. So therefore what you need to do is you need to take careful labeling and control paths. They're crucial to minimize this performance loss. and they've actually found that front-loading compute operations is vital. Rather than just going kind of like a more granular one-at-a-time approach, you're going to get issues with latency for the commands, so it's better to worry about reducing register count, which are basically the virtual registers on the GPU, and ensuring the occupancy are optimal. By the way, occupancy, if I can bloody well speak, occupancy is operations that are running on a particular GPU processor. So hopefully I've gotten all of that right. And that's part 1 done. So I've got about 1 trillion various tabs open right now. So I'm going to pretty much close out this video because it's about 30 minutes. And as I said, I've kind of skimmed over some of this stuff in the video, simply because I don't want to turn this into like a 45-minute video. As I said, there are screenshots, images, and some references, and various other bits and pieces in the article, so you can check those out if you so wish. There will be a lot more stuff coming up in the next few days, guys. I know that a lot of you have been giving me absolute ludicrous information for me to I cannot speak suddenly, perform analysis on. So yeah, I think I'm going to go before I embarrass myself with my proficient use of the English language any further. So hopefully you've enjoyed the video anyway. I'll see you soon. Take care and bye for now.